Sir, this area is restricted. I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the aircraft. The voice was sharp, laced with the kind of impatient authority that comes from being young and in charge. The old man, who had been standing transfixed by the sleek, menacing shape of the huge '60 Blackhawk, turned his head slowly. He wore a simple faded jacket, the kind you might find in a thrift store, and a pair of worn-out slacks. His face was a road map of wrinkles, but his eyes, a pale, startling blue, were as clear and steady as a winter sky. "She's a fine machine," the old man said, his voice a low, growly hum that seemed to vibrate with the latent power of the helicopter itself. Captain Evans, his flight suit crisp and his posture ramrod straight, took a step closer. He was the picture of modern military prowess. From his polished boots to the confident set of his jaw, he ran a hand over his short-cropped hair, his patience already wearing thin. It was a hot day on the tarmac, the air thick with the smell of jet fuel and shimmering heat waves. And he had a pre-flight checklist to run. He didn't have time for this. "Unsure she is, but this isn't a public exhibition. This is an active flight line, and you are in a secure zone. Now for the last time, please move along." Evans pointed vaguely toward the distant visitor's gate. "The Air Show Museum is that way, Grandpa." The old man didn't move. His gaze drifted from Evans back to the Blackhawk, his eyes tracing the lines of the fuselage, the complex rotor assembly, the stabilator tail wing. It wasn't the look of a curious tourist. It was the look of a master craftsman inspecting a piece of work. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his lips. "The tail rotor is Kane 20. He murmured more to himself than to the captain. "Gives it more lift, better stability in a crosswind." "Smart design," Evans scoffed. A short, derisive sound. "Look, old-timer. I don't know who you are, but I have a mission to prep for. My crew is waiting. I don't have time to listen to your half-baked observations. Now, are you going to walk away, or do I need to call the MPs to escort you?" The threat hung in the hot air. Two young crew chiefs, busy with their own checks nearby, paused and glanced over, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. They could see their captain's growing frustration. The old man, however, seemed completely unflappable. He finally turned his full attention back to Captain Evans, his blue eyes locking onto the young officers. There was no fear in them, no anger. There was just a profound, unsettling stillness. "MPs," the old man repeated quietly, as if tasting the word. "It's been a long time since anyone's threatened me with the military police." The corner of his eye caught the faint outline of a stenciled symbol on the helicopter's side door, partially obscured by a fresh coat of radar-absorbent paint. It was a winged dagger, the insignia of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The Night Stalkers. "Night Stalkers still fly these?" he asked, his voice soft. The question, so specific and knowledgeable, gave Evans a moment's pause. He narrowed his eyes. "That's classified information. How would you know about that?" The old man simply shrugged, a slight movement of his thin shoulders beneath the worn jacket. He reached out a hand, its skin thin as parchment, and mapped with the fine lines of 1,000 forgotten tasks, and gently laid it on the cool black skin of the helicopter. The touch was electric. The world dissolved from the shimmering tarmac of the present into a roaring, chaotic green-hued past. He wasn't an old man in a faded jacket anymore. He was a young warrant officer call sign Ghost, his hands steady on the collective of a prototype helicopter, a crude beast of a machine they called the Utility Tactical Transport Aircraft System. It was the grandfather of the very bird he was now touching. The air was thick with the smell of cordite sweat and the damp rot of the jungle. Green tracers stitched the night sky below them as he pushed the aircraft to its limits, flying nap of the earth through a labyrinth of karsts and lows. The mission was impossible. Extract AMSCVS, OG team from deep within enemy territory, a place where no one was supposed to be. The fuselage rattled violently, shaking from the strain and the concussive force of RPGs exploding nearby. His co-pilot was screaming something about the engine temperature. The red warning lights flashing like angry eyes across the primitive instrument panel. But Arthur Vance wasn't looking at the lights. He was feeling the machine. He could feel the strain on the rotor blades, the subtle shift and lift as he hugged a cliff face, the vibration in the floor that told him the transmission was about to give. He was one with the aircraft, a phantom of metal and flesh moving through the darkness. They made it out that night with 3 wounded soldiers and a helicopter so full of holes, it looked like Swiss cheese. They told him later the aircraft never flew again. They also told him he'd done something no one thought possible. "Sir, are you listening to me?" The sharp voice snapped him back to the present. Captain Evans had grabbed his arm. The touch was firm, insistent. "I'm done asking. You're coming with me." Arthur looked down at the young captain's hand on his arm, then back up at his face. The fire in his own eyes had been banked, but the embers still glowed with a heat Evans couldn't possibly comprehend. "Take your hand off me, son," Arthur said. The words were quiet, but they carried an undeniable weight, a command that had been forged in crucibles of fire and chaos. For a split second, Evans almost obeyed. He felt a flicker of doubt, a strange sense of unease. This old man wasn't just confused. There was something else there, a core of solid steel beneath the frail exterior. But his pride, his authority, had been challenged in front of his men. He couldn't back down now. "That's it," Evans said, his jaw tight. He reached for the radio on his vest. "Base security, this is Captain Evans on the South Tarmac. I have a civilian refusing to leave a restricted area, requesting assistance." One of the young crew chiefs, a specialist named Diaz, winced. He'd been watching the whole exchange, and something about the old man's calm dignity felt important. He'd seen the way the man looked at the Blackhawk, the way his hands seemed to know the machine's shape by heart. This felt wrong. On an impulse, Diaz pulled out his phone. He had a number, one he was only supposed to use in a real emergency. The base commander, Colonel Matthews, had given it to his senior NCOs, telling them to call if they ever saw something that didn't pass the smell test. This, Diaz decided, definitely stank. He quickly typed out a text. "Sir, Captain Evans is about to have an old man arrested on the flight line. Something's not right. The guy seems to know the 160th South Tarmac." A 60. He hit send, hoping he wasn't about to end his career. As Evans spoke into his radio, a black sedan with official markings was already speeding down the service road that ran parallel to the runway. It screeched to a halt about 50 yards away, and a man in a perfectly pressed uniform emerged. He was tall with salt and pepper hair and the unmistakable bearing of a senior officer. On his shoulders were the silver eagles of a full colonel. Colonel Matthews had been in a budget meeting, a slow death by PowerPoint, when his phone vibrated. He glanced at the text from Specialist Diaz. Evans was a good pilot, but he was young, arrogant, and had a tendency to see regulations before he saw people. "Knows the 160th. That line had snagged his attention. He excused himself from the meeting and told his driver to get to the South Tarmac fast. As he got closer, he saw the scene. Evans puffed up with indignation, holding onto the arm of a stooped elderly man. The old man stood perfectly still, a rock against which the waves of the captain's frustration were breaking. Matthew started walking, then his pace quickened to a jog. His eyes narrowed, trying to place the old man's face. The posture, the quiet defiance, it was familiar. Then the sun caught the old man's profile just right, and a memory, decades old, struck the colonel like a physical blow. He was a young lieutenant, fresh out of flight school, listening to a grizzled legend give a classified lecture on high-risk infiltration techniques. The lecturer was a civilian contractor then, A man who had already forgotten more about flying than most pilots would ever learn. A man they called Ghost Evans. The colonel's voice boomed across the tarmac, cracking like a whip. Captain Evans immediately dropped the old man's arm and snapped to attention, his face a mask of surprise. "Colonel Matthews, sir." But the colonel's eyes weren't on him. He walked right past his saluting captain, his gaze fixed on the old man. He stopped a few feet away, his own posture shifting from one of command to one of profound, almost reverent respect. "Mr. Vance?" the colonel asked, his voice now soft with disbelief. "Arthur Ghost Vance, is that really you?" Arthur looked at the colonel, a flicker of recognition in his pale blue eyes. He offered a small, weary smile. "Colonel, it's been a while. You were a lieutenant last time I saw you. All ears and ambition." Colonel Matthews let out a short, incredulous laugh. He shook his head, a look of wonder on his face. He then turned to the utterly bewildered and increasingly pale Captain Evans. The temperature on the tarmac seemed to drop 20. Captain Matthews began, his voice dangerously low and controlled. "Do you have any idea who you were just manhandling?" Evans swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Sir, he was in a restricted area. He wouldn't listen." "Captain, you will stand here and you will listen to me." The colonel cut him off, his voice like ice. "This man is Arthur Vance. He was one of the founding pilots of Task Force 158, before the 160th. SUR was even a gleam in the Pentagon's eye. He was flying clandestine missions and unmarked helicopters that would make your blood run cold. He wrote the operational doctrine for high-altitude, low-opening insertions that we still use today. He tested the prototype for this aircraft's great-grandfather by flying it through a monsoon, just to see if it could be done. The colonel took a step closer to Evans, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "This man has more flight hours in combat zones than you have in a simulator. He has saved more lives than you have logged in your flight book. He is a living legend. And you called him Grandpa and threatened him with the MPs." A dead silence fell over the tarmac. The two crew chiefs stared, their mouths agape. Captain Evans's face had gone from pale to a ghastly shade of white. The blood had drained from it, leaving a slick sheen of sweat on his forehead. Shame, hot and absolute, washed over him. He felt his knees grow weak. He looked at Arthur Vance, at the simple worn jacket and the kind, tired eyes, and saw not an old man, but a giant, a hero, a legend, standing right there in front of him. He had been so blind, so arrogant. Arthur, meanwhile, seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. He gave a slight shrug. It was a long time ago. Colonel just wanted to see how the new birds were holding up. Colonel Matthews's expression softened as he looked back at Arthur. A new idea, audacious and brilliant, sparked in his mind. He knew men like Arthur. They didn't retire. Their spirit just waited for the call. "Well, Arthur," the colonel said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "As it happens, we're having a little trouble with this one." He gestured to the Blackhawk. "Brand new avionics package, Captain Evans, and his crew are having a hell of a time calibrating the trim for lateral drift in a hover. The computer says it's fine, but the pilots say it feels squirrely. I bet you could feel it out better than any diagnostic software." It was a challenge, an invitation, a key to a kingdom Arthur Vance thought he had left behind forever. Captain Evans froze. His mind couldn't process the words. The colonel was suggesting he was offering. No, it wasn't possible. The regulations, the certifications, the sheer insanity of it. Arthur Vance looked from the colonel to the open door of the cockpit. For the first time that day, a genuine wide smile broke across his weathered face. It was the smile of a man coming home. "Well," he said, his voice dropping into that confident pilot's cadence, "I suppose I could take a look." Without another word, Arthur walked to the cockpit door. He moved with a new energy, the slow shuffle gone, replaced by a fluid economy of motion. He placed a hand on the frame and hoisted himself up into the pilot's seat with a practiced ease that defied his age. Captain Evans watched, paralyzed as the old man's hands, the ones he had so arrogantly dismissed, began to move across the instrument panel. They didn't fumble or hesitate. They danced. His fingers flew across the multifunction displays, buttons, and switches. His movements an intricate ballet of muscle memory. He strapped himself in, his gnarled fingers working the buckles of the 5-point harness as if he'd done it yesterday. Power's hot. Arthur's voice, now clear and crisp, crackled over the open cockpit intercom. He looked over at the co-pilot seat where a stunned young warrant officer sat, frozen in disbelief. "You mind, son?" The co-pilot just shook his head, unable to speak. Arthur's hands moved to the engine power control levers. "Clear," he called out, his voice calm and authoritative. With a smooth upward motion, he brought the levers to the flight position. A high-pitched whine filled the air as the turbines began to spool up. The sound grew into a deep guttural roar, and the massive four-bladed main rotor began to turn slowly at first, then faster and faster until it was a blurred, invisible disk above them. The whump of the blades beating the air was a physical force, a heartbeat that resonated in the chest of every person on the tarmac. Captain Evans stood rooted to the spot, his shame of physical weight pressing down on him. Colonel Matthews stood beside him, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on his face. Inside the cockpit, Arthur's hands rested lightly on the controls. He closed his eyes for a second, not in confusion, but in communion. He could feel it, the slight, almost imperceptible pull to the left. The computer couldn't detect it, but he could. It was in the vibration through the cyclic stick, in the subtle change in the rotor's harmonics. "There it is," he murmured. He made a few deft adjustments on the trim control panel, his fingers tapping at the digital interface. A little more right pedal trim bias. The software is overcompensating for engine torque. He then looked out the windscreen, his focus absolute. His left hand gently raised the collective. The roar of the engines deepened, and with a grace that seemed impossible for a multi-ton war machine, the Blackhawk lifted off the tarmac. It didn't lurch or sway. It rose vertically, perfectly, as if lifted by an invisible hand. He brought it to a 10-foot hover, holding it so perfectly still. It looked like it was parked on a plate of glass. Then he began to fly. He didn't just perform a simple check flight. He put on a clinic. He executed a pedal turn, spinning the helicopter 360 on its axis with zero drift. He performed a sideways flight, skimming the tarmac at 10 feet, faster than most pilots would dare. He transitioned into a steep climbing bank that showed off the machine's power and agility, the sun glinting off its black skin. It was a masterclass in aviation, a symphony of man and machine. Every move was fluid, precise, and instinctual. He wasn't just operating a helicopter. He was dancing with it. The young crew chiefs and the other pilots who had gathered to watch stood in stunned silence. Their faces turned to the sky. They were witnessing something that defied explanation. They were watching a ghost from the past command the technology of the future with a skill that was timeless. After a few minutes, Arthur brought the Blackhawk back to its original spot, settling it onto the tarmac with a landing so gentle it was barely perceptible. The wheels touched down without a single bounce. He spooled down the engines, the roar fading back into a whine and then silence. The only sound was the slow rhythmic sweep of the coasting rotor blades. Arthur unstrapped himself and swung out of the cockpit, landing lightly on the ground. He looked less tired than he had before he took off. He looked energized, alive. He walked over to where Captain Evans and Colonel Matthews were standing. Evans looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. His face was flushed, his eyes fixed on the pavement. Arthur stopped in front of him. He didn't look angry. He didn't look triumphant. He looked thoughtful. He reached out and placed a hand on the young captain's shoulder. "Son," Arthur said, his voice gentle. "The machine changes. The technology gets better, but the spirit of the pilot that doesn't. You fly with your hands and your feet, but you lead with your heart and your head. Never forget who came before you. We built the ladder you're climbing." Captain Evans finally looked up, his eyes swimming with shame and a newfound profound respect. "Sir, Mr. Vance, I'm so sorry. There's no excuse for my behavior. I was arrogant and I was wrong." Arthur gave his shoulder a slight squeeze and then let go. "We were all young once, Captain. We all thought we knew everything. The trick is to learn that you don't. That's what makes a good pilot a great one in." He turned to Colonel Matthews and gave a slight nod. "She's a good bird, Colonel. A little spirited, but good. You've got a fine command." With that, he turned and began to walk away. His posture once again that of a simple old man in a faded jacket, his shoulders slightly stooped. But now everyone on that tarmac saw him differently. They saw the ghost that flew through the night, the legend that had returned for one last glorious flight. Colonel Matthews watched him go, then turned to the still reeling Captain Evans. "You have a lot to think about, Captain. I suggest you start with humility." Dismissed. As Evans walked away, a changed man, the lessons of the day burned into his soul. We are reminded of a powerful truth. Heroes don't always wear uniforms or display their medals. Sometimes they walk among us, hidden in plain sight, carrying the weight and wisdom of their incredible history in the quiet dignity of their bearing. The greatest strength is often found not in loud commands and polished appearances, but in the silent, steady heart of those who have truly served. If you were moved by Arthur's story and believe in honoring the quiet heroes who live among us, please like and share this video. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us to look beyond the surface and respect the giants whose shoulders we all stand upon.